Quick disclaimer here, guys. I intended to have this out before Halloween, but unfortunately a series of cock-up cascades ended up happening that made me have to postpone it until after the Halloween season was over. Hopefully at the time of recording this, it'll at least be out soon enough afterwards to still be timely?
This holiday season, be sure to get that special someone the gift they really want. The most intense PlayStation games ever. Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil, the director's cut. Now supports DualShock analog controller.
2021 has been one hell of a year for video game anniversaries. Obviously, we have Sonic turning 30, but we've also got Zelda turning 35, Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider turning 25, The Death of Society turning 15, and just in time for the spooky season, Resident Evil. Debuting in 1996 for the PlayStation and later the Sega Saturn, Capcom took the at-the-time fledgling survival horror genre that pretty much only consisted of the Alone in the Dark series and revolutionized it while also bringing it to a level of mainstream success that horror video games had never seen before. Or at least that's its reputation. I previously took a look at the GameCube remake of the original Resident Evil, as well as gave a brief summary of my experience with the series, but in case you don't want to watch a whole separate, and in my opinion mediocre video, here's a recap. I grew up in a household that was very horror-phobic, for lack of a better term. My mom had an intense dislike for anything remotely scary, so I wasn't allowed to play games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill when they were originally released. Years down the line, when I was in middle school, I befriended this kid named Robbie, who was a die-hard horror fanatic, and gave me a crash course on not just horror movies like A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, but horror video games as well, starting with Resident Evil. I was at the age where my parents were comfortable with me watching R-rated movies, so I rented the first two entries in the Resident Evil live-action series, which admittedly wasn't the best introduction to Resident Evil, but got me interested enough to check out the games. One time, when I was visiting my grandparents in Rocky Mount, I went to a local mom-and-pop game store called Game On that always had a killer selection of retro games at affordable prices, and I saw the GameCube version of Resident Evil sitting there on the shelf. I bought it, popped it into my GameCube, or rather my backwards-compatible Wii, played it, and was immediately turned off by the controls. While I'd later pick up Resident Evil 5 when it came out, I was always too put off by the way the older Resident Evils controlled to give them a fair shot. It wasn't until very recently that I decided to try them out, and, well, that's what brings me to this video. For the month of Halloween and for the 25th anniversary of Resident Evil, I'll be looking at the original versions of the first four classic-styled Resident Evil games and seeing how they hold up from a newcomer's perspective 2 decades after they originally released. Welcome to the Resident Evil saga. Before we get into Resident Evil proper, we have a bit of history to cover. Resident Evil's roots actually trace back to 1989, with the release of the Capcom-developed RPG Sweet Home for the Famicom, which mixed traditional RPG gameplay with more of a focus on exploring and interacting with the environment, item management, and most importantly, an emphasis on horror. Flash forward to the early 90s, and Capcom starts development on a 3D remake of Sweet Home, helmed by the original game's director, Tokuro Fujiwara, who you might know as the creator of Ghosts and Goblins, and oddly enough, the creator of Tomba? Fujiwara, however, decided to change course, morphing this Sweet Home remake into an original property that would use the increased power of currently available technology to expand on Sweet Home's gameplay. Fujiwara put Shinji Mikami in the director's chair, even though he was only known for his work on Disney games at the time. This proved to be the correct choice, as Mikami decided to draw inspiration from classic horror films like George Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead to create the setting of the game, which will now be titled Biohazard. When it was time for Biohazard to be released worldwide, Capcom ran into a bit of an issue with the name. The name Biohazard was too difficult to trademark outside of Japan, so Capcom held an internal contest within the company to come up with a new title for the international release, with the winner being Resident Evil. Now, one last thing to dive into before we cover the plot synopsis is the numerous releases Resident Evil has seen in subsequent years. A year and a half after the original game's release, Capcom released Resident Evil Director's Cut as an apology for the delays in development of Resident Evil 2, and packaged it with a playable demo of Resi 2. This updated version featured slightly changed character models, a new arrange mode that swaps the locations of items and weapons, unlockable costumes for Chris and Jill, and was advertised as featuring the uncensored versions of the live-action FMV cutscenes, although this wasn't actually the case due to some sort of error in the localization process. This version would later be bundled in with the ill-fated PlayStation Classic in 2019, and is what I'll be covering for the purposes of this review. 1998 would see the release of Resident Evil DualShock Director's Cut, which added vibration feedback and analog movement to the game, as well as swapping out the original soundtrack by Makoto Tomozawa, Koichi Hiroki, and Masumi Ueda, with a new, vastly inferior one composed by Mamoru Samaguchi. Although it was discovered in 2014 that most if not all of Samaguchi's so-called compositions across multiple games were actually ghost-written by Takashi Nigaki. The Sega Saturn version features everything in the original release, as well as an exclusive battle mode that sees the player fighting through hordes of enemies with a predetermined loadout, as well as some exclusive monsters. A port for the Game Boy Color was in development, but was cancelled when Capcom finally realized that trying to do a one-to-one port of a 3D survival horror game to an 8-bit handheld console was a terrible idea, but a playable build of this cancelled game was leaked on the internet and is easy enough to find if you know where to look. The PC version finally gave people outside Japan the uncensored FMV scenes, as well as support for 3D accelerator cards for sharper graphics and some exclusive weapons. Finally, there's Resident Evil Deadly Silence for the Nintendo DS, released for the franchise's 10th anniversary, and it contains both the original game in its entirety with touchscreen support, and a new Rebirth mode that adds new touchscreen-controlled puzzles and first-person knife battle sequences. Okay, with all that history out of the way, let's dive right into Resident Evil. It's 1998, in the forests outside Raccoon City, a small town in the Midwestern United States. Reports of a roving mob of cannibal murderers have flooded the local police department, and in response, the RPD sent their Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS, Bravo team to investigate. Bravo team, however, has gone missing, and in response, RPD has sent STARS Alpha team, consisting of Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, Barry Burton, Joseph, oh he's dead, and Albert Wesker to investigate the forest for the missing Bravo team. Alpha team finds the crashed Bravo team helicopter, but before they can investigate the crash, they're chased by crazed dogs, which, due to their helicopter pilot Brad fleeing, forces them to find shelter inside the nearby Spencer Mansion. The game has two story scenarios with two different, incompatible takes on the events that transpire, so I'll do my best to cobble everything together into a cohesive narrative. Depending on whether you pick Chris or Jill to play as, they make it to the mansion safely while the other character goes missing, with Captain Wesker telling the player to investigate. Quickly into their searching, however, the player comes across a horrifying discovery. Zombies have infested the mansion, and when they go to inform Wesker about it, they find that he's gone missing as well, prompting a search not only for their missing comrades, but the mysteries behind just what happened at Spencer Mansion. Jill is accompanied throughout her story by Barry, who gets her out of some sticky situations, but as her story progresses, he starts acting more suspicious. Meanwhile, Chris finds the Bravo team's medic, the rookie Rebecca Chambers, and has her tag along to solve certain puzzles that Chris can't overcome by himself. Both of these companions are legitimately entertaining in their own ways. Barry's penchant for cheesy one-liners coupled with his oddly phrased dialogue makes him instantly memorable, while Rebecca is just so damn cute, but clearly capable of taking care of herself and Chris when the need rises. After investigating the main house of the mansion, and navigating their way through the courtyard and guardhouse where the player encounters Wesker, the player finds themselves in the underground caverns, where they discover a gravely injured Enrico, another member of Bravo team, who informs the player that this entire scenario was a setup, and that someone is manipulating stars from within to kill them off one by one. This leads them to a hidden laboratory belonging to the Umbrella Corporation, a massive pharmaceutical company who's secretly been producing bioweapons on the side, and were using the mansion as a testing facility for their new T-virus, a man-made virus that can reanimate the dead and cause mutations in animals, resulting in the zombies and other assorted monsters throughout the game. This, however, was just one of their projects, as a slideshow reveals one monster we haven't seen yet, codenamed Tyrant, as well as revealing that Wesker was secretly an Umbrella researcher all along, and that he wears his sunglasses at night. When the player and their partner confront Wesker in the Tyrant containment chamber, Jill discovers that Barry has been a lackey for Wesker all along because Umbrella has taken his family hostage, while Chris's scenario, Wesker shoots Rebecca to dispose of her. He reveals to the player that he was ordered by Umbrella to lure both STARS teams to the mansion as a way of testing the effectiveness of their new bioweapons in combat, but at the same time, Wesker plans to steal the Tyrant for his own undefined uses. Probably world domination, I don't know. The Tyrant is set free, but proves impossible to control, as it kills Wesker immediately on release and goes after the player for a final showdown. The game has multiple endings that are determined by a myriad of factors throughout the story, so for the sake of brevity, I'll just cover the two endings I got on each scenario. In Jill's story, Chris is found and rescued, but Barry is fatally wounded, and with his dying words, apologizes to Jill for everything he's done, and asks her to deliver a photograph to his family with a final message to them written on the back. The survivors make their escape by a helicopter, clearly traumatized by what they just endured, as the mansion doesn't explode in this ending, and a final shot shows the Tyrant survived. In my playthrough of Chris's story, Rebecca survives being shot thanks to her bulletproof jacket, sets off the self-destruct sequence, Chris rescues Jill from her cell, and he sets off a flare to signal their pilot for a pickup. However, Tyrant tries to stop their escape in one final climactic battle that ends with Brad the helicopter pilot tossing Chris a rocket launcher, which he uses to blow up Tyrant before everyone escapes and the mansion explodes. The story here isn't exactly anything ambitious, but sets the stage for more interesting follow-ups that could dive into the story behind the Umbrella Corporation, or explore other bioweapon projects they've been working on. The multiple endings and conflicting story campaigns make it a little tough to tell what exactly is meant to be canon, but the differences between what each character encounters in their respective playthroughs and the radically different ending scenarios you can come across make this relatively short game worth multiple replays without a doubt. As far as the visuals are concerned, Resident Evil looks passable for an early PS1 game. The game consists of 3D models for characters, enemies, and interactive objects, placed on pre-rendered 2D backgrounds, creating a stark contrast between the two that makes it easy to tell what you can interact with and what's just part of the set dressing. Unlike any time I attempt to play point-and-click adventure games, I didn't find myself furiously clicking on everything in sight to see what would make the story move forward, because of the previously stated readability of the environments and items. Each room of the mansion and surrounding areas is given an immediately identifiable and unique layout and backdrop, making it hard to get lost while exploring. Character models lack emotive faces during dialogue sequences, but make up for it with highly expressive body language, and the near-total lack of close-ups on the faces of these character models helps mask the lack of detail on them. Speaking of dialogue sequences and cutscenes, Resident Evil is, to put it extremely lightly, infamous for its shoddy script and English voice acting. Outside of the handful of live-action FMV sequences, which were obviously shot on a shoestring budget and used as many quick cuts and camera tricks as possible to disguise the incredibly fake-looking effects and props, the in-game cutscenes consist of characters wildly gesturing at each other in simple back-and-forth conversations that flow about as naturally as you'd expect from a script that was written in Japanese, translated in Japan rather than localized by an English-speaking branch of the company, and voiced not by actors who were hired necessarily for their range and talent, but because they were affordable, fluent in English, and lived nearby Capcom's offices, which was the standard for dubs of Japanese games at the time. Barry Burton's hammy performance and cheesy one-liners, delivered by Barry Guerra, God, I know I'm pronouncing that name wrong every time, who longtime viewers may recognize from Transformers Call of the Future, stand out and don't really require any further dissection because everyone already knows all of his infamously quotable lines about the Master of Unlocking and Jill sandwiches. What I was taken aback by was Chris's voice, provided by the late Scott McCulloch, who you might recognize from the original dub of Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I assumed this was due to a mix of the direction and the lackluster translation job done to the script, but Chris is a damn goldmine of quotable one-liners, overreactions, underreactions, and generally awkward dialogue who's generally gone unnoticed in the years since Resident Evil released. Just take a listen to his response to Rebecca saving him from a mutated killer plant.
Oh! I can't believe it! Are you okay?
Yeah, so much for him. We got to the root of the problem.
The music, at least in the original release and the director's cut, is minimalist but still gives each area a unique brand of overbearing dread. The standout piece here has to be the theme that plays in the mansion basement, despite how little time is spent in that area. The trio of Tomozawa, Hiroki, and Ueda's compositions perfectly match the environments and situations you encounter, but actual music tracks are generally reserved for dedicated areas. Most of the game is spent either in complete silence, or in the case of the courtyard, accompanied by ambient wildlife sounds, reminding you that you're all alone, and nobody is coming to help you. The redone soundtrack featured in the DualShock version isn't nearly as memorable or impactful for the most part, and when it is, it's not for the reasons that Samuragochi, or more accurately, Nagaki, intended. I'm a fan of Nagaki's work on the Onimusha soundtrack, but if songs like the DualShock basement theme were all you heard from him, you'd never understand why Capcom kept hired him for future projects. This is the part where I originally wanted to play a clip of the mansion basement theme, but I found a song that's even worse. Take a listen to the Spider Boss theme. The gameplay is going to either make or break the OG Resident Evil experience for newcomers, and it all comes down to one main factor: the controls. Yeah, let's go ahead and get that out of the way. Resident Evil was the game that popularized tank controls in early 3D games. For anyone who didn't grow up in this era of gaming, most consoles didn't have controllers with analog sticks for full 360-degree movement until much later in the generation. So unless you had a Nintendo 64, you were limited to 4 directional buttons for your movement controls. 3D games of this era often utilized a control scheme that would later be nicknamed tank controls, due to it feeling more like you're controlling a clunky, heavy vehicle rather than a person. Rather than pressing the direction you want to move in and moving in the accompanying direction, you can only move forward and backward, with the left and right buttons used for turning your character. I've complained about tank controls aging poorly and being difficult to move precisely and freely with in the past. But, unlike most games I've played with this thankfully abandoned control scheme, Resident Evil genuinely feels like the developers came up with the controls first, then designed the environments, enemies, and combat mechanics around your limited movement options. Environments are often claustrophobic corridors with box-shaped designs, with the occasional more open area that still shares the same rectangular shape. Since the player can't freely move in any direction at a moment's notice, you're given just enough room to orient yourself in the direction you want to go before moving forward. The camera is always placed at a fixed angle that gives you a full view of the room you're currently in, and the game makes sure that as long as you're holding the forward button, you'll retain the path that you're moving toward, rather than the game getting confused by the sudden camera angle switch that I've seen in many other early 3D games. Enemies tend to attack on sight and take quite a few bullets to put down, but move in slow, predictable patterns that make them easy to maneuver around once you learn how each type of monster acts. You start out with slow-moving zombies who can really only damage you if you get close enough for them to grab you, and the game gradually introduces tougher enemies like fast-moving dogs that are hard to pin down but take less shots to kill, the dreaded hunters that combine the fast movement and aggressive nature of the dogs with the durability of the zombies with a sprinkle of increased damage and range to make them even more deadly, and finally the chimeras, only encountered in dedicated parts of the lab, who cling to the ceiling and drop down to attack you when you aren't paying attention, alongside a few one-off enemy types like snakes that can poison you, bees that swarm you, giant spiders that spit venom and explode into swarms of babies upon death, and sharks that are deadly in water but are rendered laughably helpless once it's drained. I didn't find any of the enemy types to be too unbalanced, but the hunters often gave me more trouble than anything else in the game due to how aggressive they are, how much damage they deal with each hit, and how they can lunge at you from the other side of the room. To deal with the hordes of the undead and bioorganic monstrosities, you have a small but effective selection of weapons at your disposal. Both characters start out with a standard pistol and a combat knife. I found the knife to be absolutely useless, so I never used it in combat, but the pistol, while pretty weak in terms of firepower, is easily the most reliable weapon thanks to its plentiful supply of ammo. You see, ammo and health items are limited to specifically placed pickups in predetermined areas of the environment, and once you run out of bullets or healing items, you're left with no other option but to book it to the nearest safe space. As such, combat isn't necessarily encouraged for most monster encounters, because there simply isn't enough ammo on the map to guarantee that you'll be able to kill every enemy and boss you come across. The shotgun is a weapon I relied on once the hunters were introduced due to its high damage output and how it staggers enemies. Its ammo is less common than handgun bullets, but it's still easy to stock up on if you know where to look. The last weapon that both Chris and Jill share is the Magnum, an optional weapon that has the scarcest ammo in the game, but balances that by killing most non-boss enemies in just one hit. I like to save all my Magnum rounds for the final stretch of the game so I can just enjoy the catharsis of one-shotting everything that stands in my way, and it makes the final battle with Tyrant a cakewalk. Lastly, Chris and Jill each have one unique weapon on their respective campaigns. Jill gets the inaccurately named bazooka, which is actually more of a grenade launcher. It has 3 different types of ammo for different enemy types, but unlike the other weapons, you have to manually reload it every time you empty a clip using the inventory screen, and swapping ammo types causes you to permanently lose anything that was currently loaded. This was my favorite weapon in the game, and its acid rounds were my go-to for boss fights. Meanwhile, Chris gets the flamethrower, which is underwhelming, to say the least. The hitbox of its flame stream isn't nearly as straightforward as everything else in the game. It burns through fuel in just a few seconds, and it can't be refueled. I never use this for combat, especially since it can't be taken out of the cavern area. Combat isn't all that Resident Evil has to offer, however. In fact, most of your time is going to be spent solving rudimentary puzzles and traveling back and forth between newly unlocked areas once you find their corresponding keys, looking for items that will unlock the next area or trigger the next story event. At times, Resident Evil feels less like a game about killing zombies, and more like a 3D take on old-school adventure game. This is further emphasized by the way you manage your inventory. Each character has a limited number of inventory slots, while ammo and certain types of keys stack. Most items take up 1 slot each. Obviously, the developers didn't expect you to go through the whole game with such limited inventory space, so dedicated safe rooms contain boxes where you can swap out items you don't currently need for whatever the current situation calls for. Item boxes are interconnected across the whole game, so you don't need to worry about backtracking to a specific safe room to get a key item you need to progress if you left it in storage. Safe rooms also contain typewriters where you can save your game, but you can only use them if you have an ink ribbon in your inventory, and ink ribbons, like health items and ammo, are extremely limited. This forces the player to judge the risk versus reward on playing long stretches of the game without saving, as it's entirely possible to run out of ink ribbons permanently, and dying sends you back to the title screen, forcing you to reload your last save to continue. Chris and Jill's scenarios don't just differ in terms of story content and unique weapons, there's a few significant gameplay differences as well. Jill is clearly meant to be the easy mode, as she has 8 inventory slots, can solve certain puzzles like the V-Jolt mixture and the piano melody on her own, and thanks to Barry, she can be bailed out of certain instant death scenarios, namely the trap that activates if you try to take the shotgun from its mantle without replacing it with the broken shotgun. If you try that as Chris, the doors lock and the ceiling starts closing in, guaranteeing death. In addition, Chris can't play piano, requiring Rebecca to solve that puzzle for him. He can't mix the chemicals needed to weaken the Plant 42 boss, which leads into a segment where the plant captures him and switches control to Rebecca to mix the V-Jolt chemical needed to kill the plant at its roots. He only has 6 inventory slots, and he doesn't have Jill's unique lockpick item, meaning that he has to use collectible small keys to unlock locked drawers, and explores various rooms of the mansion in a slightly different order than Jill. He can take more hits than Jill before dying, but it's still obvious that Chris was designed to be the game's hard mode. With all that squared away, it's once again time for the verdict. While Resident Evil does have a barrier to entry thanks to its woefully outdated controls, the gameplay environments are so well designed that I honestly believe anyone can adapt to them with enough time. The way the game flips traditional action games on its head by limiting your resources and making you decide when to fight or when to flee was revolutionary for the time, and even modern survival horror games don't often limit your options nearly as much as this 25-year-old game does, which leads to an incredibly intense experience. The cheesy dialogue and poorly directed voice acting would normally be a knock against it, but it's clear that Resident Evil isn't necessarily trying to harken back to the horror gems of days gone by, but rather it wants to evoke the grindhouse B-movie genre of the 70s and 80s, and I think it does so acceptably enough. Out of all the versions I played for this review, I'd have to say I recommend the original director's cut for the closest thing to an ideal experience. Although, if you know where to look, you can find an elaborate ROM hack called the True Director's Cut, which offers the new content and improved controls of the DualShock release, with the uncensored opening and ending FMVs restored from the Japanese version, and separate options for either the original soundtrack or the redone Nigaki soundtrack, creating what is, in my opinion, the definitive way to play the original Resident Evil. Well, seems like we're off to a good start already if the first game is anything to go by. I'll actually be running 2 marathons concurrently for the next batch of episodes, so next time we'll be leaving Earth behind to explore the deepest, darkest reaches of space and face all the horrors that lie within. I'm Haseo, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Laters.